The morning light filtered through the curtains of Ethan Miller's room, casting soft stripes across his desk cluttered with books, half-written notes, and mechanical pencils worn down to their last bit of graphite. He sat silently, tying his sneakers with methodical care, as if the slowness of the act could delay the inevitability of what awaited him at school. It had been just under 3 weeks since his family moved to Maplewood, a sleepy town in upstate New York where everyone seemed to know everyone, except him. His mother's voice called from downstairs, gentle and warm, urging him not to be late. He grabbed his backpack and slung it over one shoulder. The weight felt heavier than usual, not from the books, but from the anticipation that gnawed at his chest. Each step toward school felt like a march into the unknown, and every morning, he hoped this would be the day he stopped being the new kid. At Maplewood Middle School, the halls buzzed with a rhythm Ethan hadn't yet learned. There were unwritten rules, who to avoid, which teachers let things slide, where to sit at lunch, and he hadn't been given the manual. He moved through the hallway unnoticed, his head slightly lowered, pretending to read a poster about the upcoming science fair. It was easier that way. By the time lunch rolled around, Ethan's stomach churned more from nerves and hunger. The cafeteria was a wide, echoing space with long, plastic tables and the unmistakable scent of reheated pizza. He took his place in line, his tray clutched tight, eyes darting for an empty spot that didn't feel too exposed. Then it happened, as he stepped into the seating area, scanning for a quiet place. He passed a table near the center, where a group of 8th graders lounged like they owned the room. One of them, a tall boy with dark hair and a constant smirk, caught Ethan's movement. His name was Kyle Turner, captain of the soccer team, effortlessly popular and unfortunately bored. Kyle leaned back in his chair just as Ethan passed, balancing on 2 legs like it was second nature. His voice was low, but carried far. "You don't belong here." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They slithered across the room like smoke, reaching Ethan's ears and curling around his thoughts. Laughter followed, not loud but sharp, and several heads turned. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't slow down or look back. He found a spot at the far end of the cafeteria, as close to the windows as he could get, and sat down with his tray untouched. He tried to focus on the food, but his appetite had vanished. The murmur of the cafeteria became a blur of sound, and the words replayed in his head again and again. "You don't belong here." It wasn't just a comment. It was a verdict, an invisible label stamped across his forehead. He stared out the window, watching leaves flicker in the breeze, pretending they were more interesting than anything happening inside. His jaw tightened. The sting of humiliation was familiar, too familiar. Back in his old town, things weren't perfect, but at least he had friends who got him. Here, he was starting from scratch, and so far, the blank page wasn't kind. The lunch bell rang, and the cafeteria emptied like a wave pulling back from the shore. Ethan stayed in his seat a moment longer than necessary, letting the crowd thin before he stood. As he walked out, he didn't glance at Kyle's table again, but his mind wouldn't let it go. The rest of the day passed in a fog. In math class, he found himself staring at the same equation for nearly 10 minutes before realizing he hadn't written anything down. During English, he caught snippets of a poem about identity and masks, and the words felt almost cruel in their timing. Yet beneath the hurt, something stirred. It wasn't anger exactly, more like a low, steady flame, the kind that starts small but refuses to die. He didn't cry. He didn't sulk. Instead, he began to think about how little Kyle actually knew about him, about how one sentence shouldn't hold so much weight, about how maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to wait for someone to hand him a place at the table. Maybe he could build one himself. By the final period, science class, Ethan was quieter than usual. He answered when called upon, but without the spark that usually lit up his explanations. Mrs. Thompson noticed. She always did. She was one of the few teachers who made an effort to learn everyone's name and remember the small things, like the time Ethan had asked for extra resources on renewable energy because he was curious about how solar panels worked. When the bell finally rang, releasing the students for afternoon break, Ethan was among the last to gather his things. As he zipped up his backpack, Mrs. Thompson approached his desk, holding a folder in one hand. Her expression was thoughtful. "Ethan, Do you have a minute? She asked, just loud enough to cut through the shuffle of feet and rustle of papers. He looked up, surprised. Sure. She gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. There's something I'd like to discuss with you. Can you stop by after the next period? He nodded slowly. Okay, is everything all right? Her smile widened just slightly. Nothing bad, just something important. With that, she walked away, leaving Ethan standing with his bag half zipped and a head full of new questions. For the first time that day, curiosity began to push aside the weight of humiliation. Something was coming. He could feel it. Whether it was good or bad, he didn't yet know. But he was no longer just waiting to belong. He was ready to act. The final bell of the day echoed through the corridors of Maplewood Middle School with the usual clatter of locker doors swinging open and students flooding into halls like water released from a dam. Ethan Miller moved among them with his head slightly lowered, keeping his steps measured, careful not to bump into anyone or draw attention. His thoughts weren't on the crowd around him, but on what Mrs. Thompson had said earlier. Her words replayed over and over, both unsettling and strangely intriguing. He had science class again tomorrow, so if it had been about an assignment or test, she could have spoken then. But the way she looked at him, the way her voice lowered just slightly, suggested something else, something more. He didn't want to let his imagination run wild, but it already had. Maybe someone had noticed the project he submitted last week, the one he had poured hours into, refining every line of data, every diagram, making sure it spoke clearly for itself. Even if he couldn't. Still, the silence that had followed after submitting it made him assume it had been overlooked, just like everything else lately. He was halfway down the main hallway when he felt a presence approaching. Mrs. Thompson, moving with her usual mix of purpose and calm, caught up to him just outside the stairwell. "Ethan," she said, adjusting the tote bag on her shoulder. "Do you have a second now?" He nodded, trying to hide the nervous energy bubbling beneath the surface. "Walk with me," she said, already turning down a quieter hallway near the administrative offices. The noise of the other students faded behind them, and Ethan could hear the soft squeak of her shoes on the polished tile. "I wanted to tell you this in person," she continued, "before any announcements or forms go out. I wasn't sure when I'd get another quiet moment with you." Ethan glanced at her, heart thudding now for a different reason. "We've been reviewing the submissions for the statewide Renewable Futures competition," she said. "You remember that little write-up you turned in?" He nodded slowly, afraid to hope. "Well, little might be the wrong word. Your project stood out, not just to me, but to the committee that reviews the first round of entries. You've been selected to represent Maplewood Middle School at the regional level." Ethan stopped walking. It took a second for the words to settle in. The hallway around him blurred at the edges. Voices distant. Lockers irrelevant. "Wait, seriously?" he said, voice lower than he meant it to be. Mrs. Thompson smiled. "Very seriously. You're one of 3 students in the county moving forward to the regionals. Your analysis on microgrid solar integration, they said it was one of the most technically sound and creatively written submissions they've seen this year." He blinked. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. A part of him had imagined this, but only in those quiet, impossible moments before falling asleep. The kind of hopes he never dared speak aloud. Thank you," he managed. "I didn't think anyone even read it." "Oh, they read it," she said, then paused before adding. "And now everyone else will too." He stared down the hallway, his mind racing. It wasn't just that his project had been noticed. It was that someone had looked beyond his silence, beyond the quiet lunches, and seen something he had actually built with his own hands and mind. It was like a door had cracked open, just a little. "I'll send the official notice to your parents tonight," she said. "But I want to make sure you heard it from me first. I thought you deserved that." He nodded again, still speechless, until something tugged at the edge of his thoughts. Will there be like an assembly or something?" he asked hesitantly. Mrs. Thompson tilted her head, amused. "Why?" Hoping to avoid more attention. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Kind of. Well," she said, "there might be an announcement, maybe something more, depending on what the principal decides. It's a big deal, Ethan. It deserves to be recognized. He swallowed hard, already imagining the whispers, the glances. Part of him wanted to shrink back into his shell. The other part, the one that had burned quietly in the cafeteria earlier, wanted to step forward, maybe even stand a little taller. They reached the main entrance of the school, where buses were starting to line up outside, and the rush of students returning for forgotten items or chatting in small clusters resumed its familiar rhythm. "I know it's a lot," she said, "but you earned this." Every word of that project came from someone who clearly sees the world differently and better than most kids your age. "Thank you," he said again, the word small but sincere. Mrs. Thompson turned to go, but added one last thing before stepping away. "Keep your schedule open tomorrow afternoon. There's something planned, and I think you'll want to be there." With that, she disappeared into the staff wing, leaving Ethan standing by the door with 1,000 thoughts swirling through his mind. He stepped outside, the late afternoon sun warm against his face, but it did little to steady the nerves now twisting in his chest. As he walked toward the bus, he passed Kyle Turner and two of his friends, standing near the school sign. Kyle looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. Ethan didn't slow down, didn't look away, but his body stiffened instinctively. One of Kyle's friends whispered something that made the others snicker, but this time Ethan didn't catch the words, and he didn't really care. Something had shifted. Whatever came next, he wasn't the same boy who had entered the cafeteria with a tray and no place to sit. He boarded the bus, found his usual seat near the middle, and sank into it. The vehicle rumbled to life, the sounds of chatter rising around him, but he stayed quiet, watching the streets of Maplewood pass by in a blur of trees, sidewalks, and late summer light. For once, his mind wasn't replaying insults or awkward silences. Instead, it was racing ahead, wondering what tomorrow would bring, and how different it might feel to walk those same halls with the knowledge that he did, in fact, belong here. Maybe not because someone said so, but because he had earned it, word by word, page by page, with no one watching. Until now. Morning arrived, cloaked in a strange tension. Ethan felt at the moment he opened his eyes, even before the sun had fully broken past the hills behind Maplewood. His alarm clock blinked 6:30, but he was already awake. The memory of yesterday's conversation with Mrs. Thompson hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deep inside him, humming like a low current. There was something different about today. He didn't know exactly what, only that it had been hinted at, and now it loomed ahead like a step into unfamiliar territory. The walk to school passed in a blur. He didn't remember much of the trees or the sidewalk or the hum of early traffic, only the steady beat of his own heart and the quiet resolve he carried like armor. Whatever was going to happen today, he had to be ready for it. He moved through the hallways with more awareness than usual. Faces that once barely registered now seemed to watch him longer. Or maybe that was just his imagination. Either way, he kept his gaze forward, his shoulders squared, not arrogant, just focused. Classes passed in fragments. History was a haze of dates and names he didn't process. In language arts, he stared at the board while Ms. Dawson discussed metaphorical language, but the examples slipped past him unnoticed. He tapped his pencil against his notebook, more aware of the ticking clock than the lesson itself. By the time the lunch period approached, Ethan's nerves had stretched so thin they buzzed like wires. His hands fidgeted in his lap, fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack, then releasing, only to clutch it again seconds later. The cafeteria hadn't changed. Same smells, same tables, same clusters of students. But Ethan's perspective had. He entered cautiously, unsure if what he'd been told yesterday had spread. He found his usual spot again, the same far table near the windows, and sat down without looking around too much. The hum of conversation swirled around him, punctuated by bursts of laughter or the scrape of trays across tabletops. He picked at the sandwich on his plate, his stomach too twisted to eat. Then it came. The static crackle of the intercom system silenced the room in an instant. Forks paused midair. Voices dropped to murmurs, and even the teachers on lunch duty turned toward the ceiling as the familiar voice of Principal Garrett came through. "Good afternoon, students and staff." The voice began, calm and deliberate, I apologize for the interruption, but I'd like to take a moment to recognize a student whose recent work has brought distinction not only to himself but to our entire school community. The room shifted. People sat up straighter. Conversation ceased entirely. Ethan froze, his tray pushed aside, his hands flat on the table. Ethan Miller, one of our 7th grade students, has been selected to represent Maplewood Middle School in the upcoming Regional Renewable Futures Science Competition. His project, which explores microgrid solar integration and sustainable energy use in rural communities, was chosen from among dozens of entries across the county. The silence broke into scattered whispers. Ethan felt the air tighten around him as every head in the cafeteria turned toward his table. "Ethan, please report to the gymnasium now," Principal Garrett continued. "We'd like to formally recognize your achievement." "Thank you." The intercom clicked off. Then came the ripple. A few claps started somewhere in the back. A couple of teachers nodded, but most of the students simply stared. Not maliciously, at least not all of them, but with that sharp curiosity that can feel like pressure, like judgment. Ethan stood slowly, every movement conscious, aware of his posture, his breathing, his face. As he made his way across the cafeteria, the noise returned. Hushed voices, comments too soft to catch but unmistakably about him. He kept walking. His legs felt both heavy and too light at once, and the distance to the gymnasium door stretched out like a gauntlet. He passed Kyle's table on the way. Kyle didn't say anything, but his eyes locked on Ethan's for a half-second too long. Not mocking, not amused, just watching. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't break pace. If there was ever a moment to walk straight and steady, it was now. The gymnasium lights were on, flooding the hardwood floor with brightness. As Ethan stepped inside, the echo of his footsteps bounced off the walls. At the far end of the gym stood Principal Garrett, Mrs. Thompson, and a few other staff members, gathered near a fold-out table draped in a school banner. In Mrs. Thompson's hands was a white envelope and what looked like a certificate. A few cameras were set up nearby, local press maybe, or just the school yearbook team. He hadn't been warned about that. "Ethan," Principal Garrett said, extending his hand as he approached. "Congratulations. We're proud to have you represent us." Ethan shook the offered hand, not trusting his voice just yet. He nodded politely, stealing a quick glance at the small group of faculty and the camera lens pointed at him. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly and stepped forward. "You earned this, Ethan," she said, holding out the certificate. "Your project was detailed, insightful, and incredibly relevant. The judges said it showed not just understanding, but vision. That's rare." He accepted the certificate with both hands, glancing down at his name written in sharp black ink. For a moment, everything else faded. The cafeteria, the whispers, the weight of being new. There was only this, the proof in writing that his voice mattered, even if he hadn't spoken out loud. Principal Garrett turned to the small crowd of staff, now gathering around. "We're going to include this in tomorrow's newsletter and post the photos online," he said. "Let's get a few shots of you holding that, Ethan." He stood still as the camera clicked a few times. He didn't smile too widely, but his expression held firm. Confidence wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just choosing not to shrink. After the photos were taken, he was allowed to head back to class, but Mrs. Thompson caught up to him before he reached the doors. "I know this was a lot," she said quietly, "but I meant what I said yesterday. You deserve every bit of it." "Thank you," Ethan replied, voice steady now, though still soft. "Really?" She gave a brief nod, and he walked out, certificate tucked carefully in his folder. The hallway beyond the gym was empty, and for the first time since arriving in Maplewood, the silence around him didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. He walked slower this time, more present in his body. The faces he passed on the way back to class looked at him differently, not with pity, not with confusion, just recognition. It wasn't applause. It wasn't sudden popularity, but it was something, and that something was enough for now. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan felt the day tilting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Returning from the gymnasium to his final class, he had expected to blend back into the background. Recognition, after all, had always been fleeting for him, something that appeared briefly and vanished before it could settle. But this time, Something lingered. His classmates didn't treat him with sudden reverence, but the atmosphere had shifted. Eyes followed him not with amusement or indifference, but with curiosity, restrained, cautious, perhaps even respectful. In homeroom, when he opened his science binder, a folded note fell from between the pages. It wasn't anonymous. Anna Lee, who sat diagonally across from him, had signed her name at the bottom. The message was simple. I read about your project. That was seriously cool. I've never heard of microgrids before. Ethan didn't know what surprised him more, the compliment or the fact that she had read anything about his work at all. He looked up, and Anna met his eyes with a small nod before returning to her notebook. It wasn't an invitation to become best friends, but it was a gesture, and that mattered. The class dragged on, filled with worksheets and the low buzz of end-of-day fatigue. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the moment in the gym, not out of vanity, but because for the first time, he'd seen something shift in the faces around him. The same students who had ignored him during lunch or avoided eye contact in the hallways now seemed to register his presence. And though he hadn't changed anything about himself overnight, their perception had begun to evolve. After the final bell, Ethan moved more slowly than usual. He lingered at his locker, organizing his books with unnecessary care. The hallways were thinning, students peeling off toward buses or pickup lines. But he wasn't in a rush. For once, the weight pressing on his shoulders was lighter, almost manageable. As he zipped up his backpack, a voice broke the quiet. Hey, Miller. He turned to find Kyle Turner leaning against a locker across from his. The casual stance was typical, arms crossed and one sneaker pressed flat against a locker door. But something in Kyle's expression was unfamiliar. Not aggressive, not mocking, just unreadable. Ethan straightened instinctively. Yeah. Kyle shrugged. So you're the science kid now. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if it was a statement, a compliment, or something else entirely. I guess so, he said finally. Didn't think anyone around here even looked at those projects, Kyle added, gaze flicking briefly to Ethan's backpack before returning to his face. Me neither, Ethan replied, voice level. A beat of silence passed. Then Kyle tilted his head slightly, as if sizing him up again, but this time not to intimidate, more like he was assessing whether they were now playing a different game entirely. Well, Kyle said, pushing off the locker with a nudge of his shoulder, don't let it go to your head. The next regionals are brutal. My cousin bombed out last year in the first round. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, unsure if that was meant to rattle him. Good thing I'm not your cousin, then. A flicker of amusement, or maybe surprise, crossed Kyle's face, and for a moment, he looked almost impressed. But he didn't say anything else. He just gave a low whistle and walked off, hands stuffed in his hoodie pocket, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't sure if that exchange had been a threat, a warning, or some strange form of acknowledgement. Either way, he hadn't backed down, and that meant something. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gray, heavy with the promise of early autumn rain. The wind carried the smell of leaves beginning to crisp at the edges, and Ethan pulled his jacket tighter as he started down the sidewalk. He thought about Kyle, about Anna's note, about the certificate now tucked carefully in the front pocket of his binder, and he thought about what it all meant. For the first time, he wasn't walking home trying to escape the day. He was processing it, turning it over in his mind not to find where he went wrong, but to trace the small victories he hadn't expected to find. His steps were slower, but purposeful. He wasn't in a hurry to get away from anything. Not anymore. When he reached the corner near Maplewood Park, a voice called out again, this one unfamiliar. Hey, Ethan. He stopped, surprised. A boy he recognized but had never spoken to, Jason, from 8th grade, who usually wore headphones and sat near the back of the bus, jogged up beside him. You're the one going to regionals, right? Jason asked, slightly out of breath. Ethan nodded cautiously. My brother's in high school. He did that competition 2 years ago. Jason said. He said the judges ask really weird questions, like stuff you don't even expect. He told me to tell you, know your weak spots. That's where they'll go first. Ethan blinked. Thanks. I didn't know that. Jason shrugged. Yeah, no problem. Just figured you might want a heads up. With that, he turned and cut across the park, his skateboard slung under one arm. Ethan stood there for a second longer, then continued on. That night, after dinner, he sat at his desk with his notes spread out in front of him. He didn't feel tired, though the day had drained him. Instead, he felt something steadier than excitement, focus. There was work to do. He opened his project folder, scanned the pages, and for the first time since submitting it, started making edits. Not because he had to, because he wanted it to be better. The room was quiet except for the soft scratch of his pen and the steady hum of thought. And when he finally looked up and saw the time, nearly 10 o'clock, he didn't panic. He just smiled slightly, turned off the light, and let the darkness settle around him like a promise. Tomorrow would be different again, but he was ready. The next morning came with the first true signs of autumn, the kind that colored the town in golden undertones and added a faint crispness to the air. Maplewood looked different under this soft light, sharper, more awake. Ethan stood at the window for a long moment before school, watching the leaves rustle on the sidewalk, his reflection faint in the glass. He still couldn't quite name the feeling growing inside him. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was quieter than that, the steadiness of someone beginning to believe in their place, not because it had been granted, but because it had been earned. At school, the morning routine unfolded with a rhythm he now understood more intimately. He moved through the halls with a new awareness, not of himself, but of how people watched him. Not many approached him directly, but the shifts were subtle. A head turning as he passed, a locker closing a second too late, its owner distracted by his presence, a nod from a teacher he didn't know well. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but the undercurrent of dismissal that had once shadowed his every step had been replaced by something resembling interest. As he turned the corner toward his homeroom, he nearly collided with Anna Lee. "Oh," she said, catching herself. "Hey, sorry, I was actually looking for you." Ethan raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Really? Yeah, I didn't want to bother you yesterday, but I was serious about your project. My dad works in energy policy, and I showed him a copy of your abstract, the one that went around the school newsletter. He said it was ambitious, and that's a compliment coming from him." Ethan felt a warmth rise in his chest that he struggled to hide. "Thanks. That really means a lot." Anna smiled, then hesitated. "If you ever want to talk through some of the regional prep stuff, I'd love to help. I did debate last year, different skill set, but kind of similar pressure." "Sure," Ethan said, genuinely pleased. "I'd like that." She gave a nod and continued down the hallway, and Ethan remained in place for a moment, watching the morning light cast sharp angles across the tile floor. He wasn't used to conversations that ended with possibility. For so long, everything felt like a wall he had to climb. Every interaction either a dismissal or a negotiation. But this was something else. The rest of the morning moved quickly. In science class, Mrs. Thompson incorporated a short segment on renewable energy sources into the day's lesson. Though she didn't mention Ethan by name, her eyes flicked toward him once, and the message was clear. She hadn't forgotten. Neither had the others. Several students glanced in his direction during the discussion, and while most stayed silent, the attention was no longer tinged with mockery. It was cautious, but not cold. Then lunch came. Ethan hesitated near the cafeteria doors, tray in hand, eyes scanning the room. The familiar anxiety pricked at the edges of his confidence. The table near the windows, his usual seat, was unoccupied, but so was a smaller table closer to the center, one where Anna and a few others sat, talking over open notebooks and half-eaten sandwiches. She caught his glance, offered a nod, a quiet invitation, not insistent, not performative, just a gesture that said, "If you want, there's space." He walked toward the table slowly, every step deliberate. When he arrived, Anna shifted her tray slightly, making room, and he sat down without needing to explain himself. The conversation continued around him, natural and unforced. Someone asked a question about the upcoming science fair, and another mentioned the school's robotics club. Ethan listened, contributed when he had something to add, and found that no one interrupted or dismissed him. There was still a distance, that careful space people leave when they're not yet sure how close to get but it was smaller than before. That space was shrinking. Halfway through the meal, the sound of sneakers scuffing against tile pulled his attention to the far end of the cafeteria. Kyle Turner was standing near the vending machines, surrounded by his usual group. He wasn't laughing, and he wasn't talking. He was just watching. Their eyes met again. This time, Ethan didn't look away. The stare held, not long, but long enough. Kyle's mouth twitched, not into a smile, not into a sneer. Just a neutral, unreadable line. Then he turned back to his friends, grabbing a soda from the machine as if nothing had happened. Ethan returned his gaze to the table. The moment passed without commentary from those around him. But inside, something shifted again, not a monumental change, but a quiet one. That look had not been filled with condescension, nor had it been friendly. It had been something more complex. Recognition. Acknowledgement. When the lunch bell rang, Ethan gathered his tray with the rest of them, walking alongside classmates instead of trailing behind. The corridor buzzed with typical midday chatter, but it no longer drowned him out. He was part of it now. Not a centerpiece, not a leader, but not invisible either. That afternoon, a guidance counselor called him in for a brief meeting. She had seen his name mentioned in the principal's announcement and wanted to talk about academic support for competition prep, potential mentorship options, and, if he was interested, future opportunities at the state and national levels. Ethan listened carefully, grateful but cautious. It was easy to be swept up in offers, harder to stay grounded. But as he left the office with a few pamphlets tucked under his arm, he felt a rare sensation: control. The school day ended under gray clouds and a whisper wind, but Ethan's steps were firm, grounded. As he made his way out, he noticed students passing by who nodded, who didn't pretend not to see him. And when he reached the sidewalk and began to walk home, he passed Kyle again. This time, there were no words, no confrontation, just the two of them walking in opposite directions. A single glance exchanged, followed by silence. But it wasn't empty. It was a kind of silence that said, "I saw you, I know you're here, and maybe you're not what I thought." Ethan walked on, eyes forward, the buildings and trees of Maplewood rising around him like a town slowly shifting shape, not changing overnight, but changing nonetheless. And within that quiet transformation, he carried something more powerful than pride, the certainty that his presence no longer needed justification. He belonged.